we're the temp agency.
Yeah, this is the temp agency edition of the Osint Bunker podcast. Where we have, a few guests on to replace certain members who decided that they didn't want to be on. Ugh, the replacements, Osint Bunker edition. All right, well, I'm just going to start this podcast off and we'll just wander. I mean, I'm sure you guys have listened to this thing and have a general idea of how chaotic it is. It's,
Yeah.
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 Yeah. So, all right, let's just kick into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Osint Bunker podcast. I am Osinttechnical, your belated announcer, host, and slightly, whacking various moles enthusiast for today. I have two people with me today who are replacing my other server hosts who are either indisposed or sort of on the other side of the planet. So we have the Intel Hub here, and we have Casus Belli, who both are extremely experienced in the Osint space, and I'm going to say that very generously to both of them. They definitely, we all talk all the time, and this should be an interesting episode, as we mainly focus on Ukraine. Because, of course, whenever we go away for a few weeks and have a bit of a break for reasons, Ukraine just ends up melting down. So I think we should probably just launch into it and say, conscription. What's everyone's thoughts on the issue?
Yeah, go on.
I think generalized, it's really easy to say that it's rough. It's going really rough for Russia in regards to the training and turnaround time that most of these conscripts are getting in the mobilization effort overall. It seems like there might be two different directions that mobilization route's going. One of which is to fill in and try to enable some of those elements that have already faced over attrition, and then the other half seems to be more so the actual formation of new elements to try to fill in some lines on the forward line of troops for Russia. However, it seems for the most part they're numbers that are being added to BTGs and DTGs that are already over attrited.
Yeah, and I think as our sort of resident enlisted personnel enjoyer now, we should probably talk about just how hard it is to actually generate new units out of what is effectively nothing.
Yes.
You actually need command structure to do things.
And I guess especially in Russia, since there's obvious lack of infrastructures and money and even officer and instructors. But so I don't know honestly how it will go, but I think we've all seen all these videos and footage showing all how people are not prepared for this, and how they have very poor equipment. So honestly, I don't know how it will go for the conscript, but I think it will be very difficult on the ground. And one question remains is why they didn't mobilize since the beginning, and why now? Probably because there's a lot of casualties. But yeah, I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, at least seeing the most recent offensive from Kharkiv and in that area is that once Ukrainian forces were able to break, those Russian front lines, those sort of islands of Russian control in towns, really they were able to just run around in the rear areas, because apart from maybe a few police units and I don't know, maybe some National Guard soldiers, there was just nothing on the Russian side that was just behind the front line. I mean, we saw civilians openly, up and hanging Ukrainian flags all over the place before the Ukrainians actually arrived. There wasn't that control behind the front line, and that probably was a manpower issue. And that is somewhere, at least, that I think that sort of conscripts can fill in easily is just putting bodies behind the front lines so that, instead of the Ukrainians being able to drive down, 50 kilometers in pickup trucks without facing any, issues or any resistance at all, there's at least, a few people to take some pot shots at them or put up a bit of a resistance, so maybe there's a possibility that other units can come in and kind of plug the gap.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, you're right. And looking at Russian doctrine and strategy overall, one of the general key assumptions that was made beforehand, before we saw Russia conduct their invasion, was that they would utilize their conscripts as rear area security, and ensuring that key infrastructure, key trains actually controlled, in order to enable the main elements, the professional army, the contract army, to move forward. But that's something that was completely missing throughout the initial portions of the invasion all the way to today. What, like 200 and what, like 14 days in, something crazy like that, into their 72-hour special military operation, quote unquote.
Yeah, and I'm willing to bet that actually the MP units and, those other rear area security units have sort of gotten hollowed out as they've been used to kind of fill in losses in the frontline units. And now they're
Yep.
basically facing issues where there's just kind of, again, no one behind
Yeah,
those front lines.
Yeah, and
yeah,
I think go ahead.
yeah, yeah. I was going to say there's a very huge problem on the ground in terms of people available for their, I'd say, operation. But yeah, as I said, I think I've told it many times in our group chat, but uh, I know some people on the ground, on even in Russian side, and they're all confirming that it's going to be a very bloody mess. And yeah, I think this is a very huge problem for Russia because they can't they can't present, for even for their own opinion, they can't present a loss or anything. And I think we've all seen um, how the medias and all this I'd say elites in Russia reacted to the counter-offensive made by Ukraine, and now they have to make any progress on the ground. They have to show that they can win in Ukraine, and they don't have any choice. And I think they're now starting to put everything they have, even conscripts. They don't have any training. They don't have any decent weapons, and yeah, this is going to be a very mess.
Yeah, I think I had joked about it, but I'm sadly seeing this become more realistic. Is what
Yeah.
would have been, new created or newly minted mechanized units being mainly infantry,
Yeah.
maybe with older
Mm,
trucks to sort of move them around from place to place, but still primarily foot mobile groupings and foot
Yeah.
mobile sort of operational units, which I mean, I think we've talked about, really how that restricts the Russians if they were to sort of put together an offensive with their, new conscript units, sort of where they would be able to put them into use. Because Russian strategy, since the Cold War has kind of relied on that. Use your heavy mechanized units to make a
mm,
breakthrough, and then use lighter mechanized units to exploit it, and then use VDV as well behind the front lines to cause chaos and indict or stop any possible counteroffensives or reinforcing units to move in to stop you. And I mean, now the Russians really seem to be kind of moving in that direction where they're going to overcome that by just throwing men at the problem. Um,
Yep.
and I really don't see a place where or there are only a few places where I feel like that could work. Um, Short of just putting bodies in the way of any Ukrainian counteroffensives. And I think that really is focused in the north because, as it's been for the entire war, there's definitely this really big difference between the competence and the ability of the southern offensive to actually get things done, in their terrain and within the realm of possibility versus what, Russian forces in the north of Ukraine and in the east of Ukraine have been able to do. Um, and so I think any conscripts going to the southern front will probably be integrated into existing units or actually kind of put to work in a reasonable manner for what they're
Yeah.
capable of doing, versus in the
Hmm.
north, where I really do expect them to just be kind of thrown at the Ukrainians.
Yeah. Yeah. This is basically what I've heard from the ground, and this is even what some Russian officer are expecting on around Kharkiv and all these areas. I think they're going to really throw all their mobilized people, and they will send them in this area. And I think this is maybe the way that Russia found to, you know, fill the hole and just send tons of people trying to um, uh, crush Ukrainian position. But honestly, I think it's not it's obviously not the good way to do. And one of my question was, do you think, guys, Belarus will be involved in this new action? I think.
Um, I mean, if you look at the Belarusian armed forces,
Yeah.
they're not exactly known for being the most capable, grouping of military power. I mean,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
have what, 30,000 active duty service members,
Mm,
and they're still all in Belarus right now. So basically, their options would be basically pick up the entire Belarusian armed forces and move them over to Donetsk and move them over to eastern Ukraine,
yeah.
which would possibly cause internal issues in Belarus, as the army kind of exists there additionally partially to tamp down any unrest and any other issues. They don't exactly have that as strong of a state security force as Russia does,
Mm,
or at least as ingrained or as officialized. Um, so there is that tendency to call the army in for those larger scale issues. And I think sort of plunking down the entire army, hundreds of miles away in a situation where they can't easily kind of pull them back, would introduce some issues and internal issues in Belarus right now. I mean, as I will always make this joke on every episode of the podcast, what
yeah.
can Russia do? Send the VDV? I mean,
They already sent
They
them,
tried
right?
that on
Yeah.
February 24th, 5th.
yeah.
Yeah.
um, I think that Belarus's utilization in the next phase of this is more of the same from the initial days of the invasion. Um, we'll probably see an uptick in TBMs being utilized from Belarus, potentially some UAVs, and maybe some ground-based aircraft. Um, other than that, I don't really see Belarus fully committing forces for Russia unless essentially their options are, hey, do this or die, which very well could
Yeah.
be the case. But even if that was the case, I feel like there would be a very large uh, political issue within Belarus once that was announced. So I think it's a very interesting subject to talk about at the very least.
Yeah, I again at some point it's 30,000 soldiers. Yes, they're professional.
Yeah.
They're actually equipped. They're in
Hmm.
units, which is definitely an advantage over the current Russian conscript force. Um,
Yeah.
but they're kind of needed in Belarus just to be
Yep.
in Belarus. Um,
Exactly.
whereas there is a possibility that I guess Belarus could maybe sell or transfer some of their equipment to Russia. Um, though I mean, if you look at the Belarusian armed forces, I mean their main their main armored personnel carrier I think is still um, the BTR 70, which
Yeah.
the Ukrainians aren't, or the Russians, at this point, if they're trying to generate new units, won't refuse. Um, but I definitely think there is a certain level of need for newer, or not newer but more equipment than Belarus is able to provide. I mean, let me double check. Yeah, I mean they have what, 2 battalions of BTR 82As,
Yeah.
39 BTR 70s. They just
Yeah, it's kind of pathetic.
Yeah.
to make an actual change. And I think that kind of goes back to the first point that we were talking about in regards to the shift in hey Russia is a mechanized military. They operate with mechanized infantry, which essentially cleans up the mess after the artillery gets the job done. Well, at least that's what they're supposed to do with Russian doctrine. What we're seeing right now with the mobilization efforts and whatever efforts pulled forward in the future is a primarily light infantry type force. At best, maybe mobilized infantry, but certainly not mechanized infantry or anything along those lines, which brings its issues. You lose mobility, and when you lose mobility, you lose capability.
Yeah.
And you also gain the negative trait of being able to be targeted by fires much more effectively. And something tells me that those conscripts aren't going to want to fight when they see, everyone else that they just got dragged off to the front line with blown up by um, Ukrainian fires in a TAI that was already made.
Yeah, and that is the one advantage. The Ukrainians have so much of a more complete ISR capability at the
Yep.
moment. They are in a lot better of a position where they can put down fires onto staging points, and they can put down
Yep.
fires onto transport links and troop concentrations. And I mean, we're seeing again. I'm like, this is maybe 2 month old information at this point, but I think it still rings true. Though in war, things change fairly quickly. But the Russian soldier who is commenting on the fact that the Ukrainians are able to call down fire on them incredibly quickly, and sort of accurately with their very good level of fusion between those lower level units and headquarters, and the background infrastructure links and the background command links to actually then get the fire onto a location. And I think that's continuing to hold true. I mean, they've definitely taken routes that are unusual to get that proper level of sort of togetherness, that proper fusion between those lower levels and upper levels. I mean, we've seen them using Google Meets and Google Hangouts to set up live streaming from their drone to
Yeah.
a battalion headquarters. But hey, that works. It's
Yep.
generally
Yeah.
pretty secure, and they're getting live data back to the headquarters. Um, so
I think you said a
oh no, go ahead.
Go ahead. I think you said a really key word also in there. You said fusion, and that
U.S.
brings
Army
straight to intelligence.
buzzwords.
So, you said a major buzzword right there, and I think you killed it because looking at Ukraine is doing an amazing job at collecting that information through FMV, processing it, exploiting it, and then disseminating it, and then not only through imagery but also second human sources, fusing it all together and providing their battlefield commanders timely and accurate information in order to make those decision points and in order to enable fires and maximize damage on the enemy, which is exactly what we train in the Western military. So
I
props to
wonder
Ukraine
why
for doing
it's
it
like that.
amazingly. Almost like we trained them since what? What year? How many years?
It's almost
Yeah.
like we've been
Meanwhile,
telling them exactly how to beat the Russians for 8 years now.
almost like the U.S. Army actually wrote the book with Ukraine on how to defeat the Russian BTG.
Yeah, the
um,
the Ukrainians are writing the second half of the book now, but
yeah,
it definitely, and these lessons will probably be taken into the future. And I would be seriously nervous if I were China right now, because a lot of these lessons are being integrated very, very well.
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
that's the whole question. I think, I wonder how China will react in terms of military equipments and training, and they also watching all this war, and I guess they have their own officer learning, and I don't know how they will act in the future, but yeah, I think it will be interesting to keep an eye on them and
Yeah,
see what they can deploy and how they can practice war, right?
I will say, at least with the drone warfare element, if you look
Mm,
at where most of those drones are from,
yeah,
DJI
China,
is the major
DJI.
supplier, China.
Yep.
And I don't think we've seen as much integration of those cheaper drones into the Chinese military, at least openly, though, again, the Chinese have a pretty good control over what they publicize with their structural stuff, their sort of their organizational and doctrinal
Mm,
level thinking. Um,
Yeah.
but I would have to imagine at this point that they're able to also spend some time and integrate those lighter unmanned aerial assets into sort of their force structure. I've always argued that if anything, we need fire team level drone support, in the U.S. military, which is what we're seeing in Ukraine now. Everyone and their freaking dog has, a little,
yeah.
DJI Mavic or something that they can just throw up briefly to get a picture of, what's over the next hill, or, maybe what's behind that building,
Yep.
or what's in that trench. Which is a huge advantage even at the fire team level. It really allows you to get that personalized info, for that thing that you want to do and where you want to go. No, it's actually safe. And
And
these drones were made for regular people. They're not exactly rocket science to handle. I have one, and I am a moron. So if I can use it without crashing it, then I'm pretty sure anyone can.
yeah,
Well,
and it all comes down to the increased situational awareness. And that increases your probability to survive and maximizes your probability to kill the enemy. It minimizes those small mistakes that add up.
yeah. On overall, I think it will be there will be a before and a after to this war in terms of strategy and uh, drone capabilities, and for all countries, even Russia. I mean, I don't know how it will end, and I don't know how Russia will end. But in any case, you will have both sides, Ukraine, Russia, and all the country who are probably following all this war. They will probably learn a lot on how to integrate all these small cheap drones, and I think they were in fact actually already doing it, or at least for French army. But I think it will be more, integrated not from now. And the question is, how it will be in the future, since I mean DJI was the most used drone, I guess, on the ground. So are we able to produce such similar drone, cheap and very easy to use? That's I think this is a great question.
Yeah, and at least we've found at this point, or what I'm seeing is that the counter to these drones isn't just it
Yeah.
isn't there yet. I mean, we've seen drone jamming devices deployed on both sides, but they just aren't there in the numbers
Yeah.
yet to actually be that effective. Because again, it's down to like the fire team level right now. There are just so many of these small drones flying around that it's
Mm,
it's kind of hard to detect and then jam or detect and destroy. We've seen the Ukrainians have some success with jamming and dropping commercial drones. I think there was a video posted by War Gonzo showing Ukrainian forces successfully bring down a Russian, I think it was a Mavic. Um, but and again, these are completely unsecured data links on these drones. These are 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi. This
yeah.
is something that's pretty easy
The
to
basics.
Pretty
direction
easy
find.
to hack. Yeah,
Yeah, and
definitely.
you can also pick up the funniest part is you can literally pick up where the drone was launched from. It is
Yep.
openly broadcasting its
Really?
return to home location. Yeah, for all these DJI drones, if you have it's really stupidly simple software, can actually identify where the drone's return to home point is. So,
Damn.
yeah,
Yeah, this is a major problem, but I guess they probably will find an issue to fix such software problems, and I
yeah.
mean they will adapt them for armies, I guess. But most important is to find a way for Western armies to get such drones for cheap prices and easy way to use, and we shall be capable to produce them in our country instead of importing them from China in the future, I think.
Yeah, well, I think there's also the other problem that the US spent just an immense amount of money
Yeah,
on
yeah.
micro UASs like that little Black Hornet Nano thing which, like,
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
sure, yeah, that's fine. It's great. It's tiny. It has pretty good life, but I mean, the unit alone, each individual unit costs
Yeah.
$200,000.
This is crazy. Yeah.
Where, whereas you can literally go to your nearest like Best Buy, buy a DJI Mavic Mini, and have probably better sensors, better flight time, and basically just as good when dealing with an enemy force, at least for right now. Obviously in the future it's better for $500. But like I think that is a hole that sometimes Western countries fall into, of
Mm.
overbuilding something. In fairness, when we overbuild something, it ends up being really good. We get the HIMARS, we get, the M777, we get these systems that are just immensely capable. But I think there's also the need to integrate those lower level, I would say lower capability, but commercial capabilities that are advanced really quickly by commercial companies. And, if you need to make new software for a Mavic, do that. If you don't trust the Chinese software for it, which again is an issue moving into the future.
Yeah.
But yeah, I definitely think there should be more of that focus on that utilization of commercial assets. Because again, we've seen, Mavics dropping grenades, dropping 40 millimeter high explosive grenades on Russian positions just over and
Yeah.
over and over
Yeah.
again. And they have this capability that I really don't think somehow the US doesn't have at the moment. I mean, yeah, sure, we have the Switchblade, but I don't even know what the Switchblade unit cost is. I would have to figure that out. It's not cheap though.
Yeah, since we're talking about drones, I've noticed that there's no at all presence of ground drones. I mean, they're at least almost absent from the ground, and I wonder if it's maybe too early for. I mean, they're not uh, that good to be deployed on the ground. But yeah, I was kind of surprised because we didn't saw, at least I didn't saw any significant ground drone,
I
and yeah, I was kind of
I think
disappointed, to be honest.
I think the problem with a ground drone is that some buck private can run up to it, pick it up, and steal it. I think
Yeah.
I think that's one of the many
Of
issues with it,
course.
is you
Yeah.
run into an issue where they're kind of vulnerable at the moment. They don't really have that capability, and I'm assuming the sensor capabilities on it, they're slow. And if they overextend themselves and get into an area where obviously they're gonna have to go to that area to fight,
Yeah.
they just become more vulnerable. Um,
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen the Russian demining unmanned ground
Yeah. Yeah.
vehicles,
Yeah. And it
um,
was deployed, but
which
I don't know. I don't know if if it adds any great value, honestly, because yeah, it's a drone and it's it's modern and all this stuff. But I don't know if it's very useful in the end.
I mean, for
In if
demining,
it's
sure, because you're keeping a person out of harm's way.
mm,
You're keeping a potentially valuable person away from something that's gonna explode.
yeah,
Um,
sure, definitely.
and then there's the
But
Ukrainian. Oh no, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, the Ukraine. I was going to ask you what Ukrainians had in terms of the mining drones, maybe, or stuff like that. I'm not
Uh,
very aware on this topic, but
as we've seen a few times right now, the general Ukrainian school of demining is if it's an
yeah,
anti-tank mine,
yeah,
throw
I remember.
if it's an anti-personnel mine, throw a small rocket. If it's an anti-tank mine,
Yeah,
throw a big rock at it. But that
yeah,
that seems to be the general direction of Ukraine. And no, that's not
Hey,
mean to
I mean,
say, but we have seen a bit more analog methods used by Ukrainian EOD personnel.
yeah, true.
also keep in mind though how the Kurds have been dealing with mines for the last 20 years, just as manually, but definitely easier, safer ways that would be beneficial to invest in.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think definitely. I mean, when the Ukrainians have to do stuff like deal with PFM mines, I think I posted an image today where it's
mm.
basically just for something of that size class, a fishing pole, should work. a fishing pole with a rock on the end, basically. Um, yeah, that I mean
Yeah, I'm just
that's
looking at the picture right now, and
yeah. I
yeah, this
mean
is crazy.
yeah, for dealing with those small risks, again, the demining effort in Ukraine, these guys have gotten pretty experienced with dealing with a large variety of these threats recently, and again, they're also working in areas that are secure. These
Mm,
aren't the guys working on the front lines who are working through static minefields. Though, granted, we've seen the defensive lines change so quickly in sort of the past few weeks and even months at this point that static minefields, maybe outside of some that the Russians have possibly built in Kherson Oblast, um, probably aren't a threat or as much of a threat. Of course, the Ukrainians have been leaving behind those German DM-22s,
mm,
but those are more of a one-time threat where it goes off and it damages a vehicle in a convoy or something passing by. So I don't think we've run into that yet. Mainly the Russian demining efforts at the same time have been going and removing Ukrainian minefields set out between 2014 and 2018, um,
mm.
where you kind of have those, removing those static Ukrainian fortifications. But that's mainly for political reasons. To be honest, is sort of removing that former line that the Ukrainians had against the separatist areas. Um, so that's
Yeah,
more of a political demining effort. Um, but yeah, a lot of that operational demining, I guess, has been sort of less in place.
yeah, and I think this war in the end showed that all this artillery and tanks are still useful for any war. And I say that because I was hearing for years many people saying like tanks are not that useful, and same for artillery. But now in Ukraine we just realize that how it could be important in the end. And by the way, what do you think? What kind of tanks the US could send to Ukraine? And I ask you that because I was very waiting for the day to see Abrams opening fire toward T-19, But yeah, I don't know. What do you think? What can they send to Ukraine in
Yeah,
terms of tanks?
I mean, the problem with the Abrams is that it just is under the hood. It's such a different thing than the Ukrainian maintainers have been
Yeah.
dealing with.
Uh,
That there would have to be a completely rebuilt sort of maintenance supply line and sort of this maintaining um, sort of complex built for these Abrams. Whereas, it would be a bit simpler if you were to rely on Leopards or
yeah,
something, I
probably.
mean, it's why, Poland basically got cleaned out of T-72s.
Mm,
Because those were, the Ukrainians know how to work on them and they know how to use them
yeah,
and they fit very easily into, existing Ukrainian units. Um, Whereas these other systems, obviously the Ukrainians learn quickly. They've demonstrated that they are very competent on, extremely complex systems that we send them. I will say it's kind of funny with the HIMARS. We kind of
yeah.
we kind of wrote them little cards on what to press, and they did great with them. Um, but that was done super quickly, and I do think there is a level where the U.S. should start focusing on training these forces
Yeah,
on
definitely.
on we should be taking Ukrainian maintainers out of Ukraine or even Ukrainian
Yes.
conscripts and training new
Mm,
Ukrainian conscripts on the entire NATO stack of maintaining. Because again, and that is another problem. A lot of these crews that should be learning these new technologies kind of have to be in Ukraine right now, fighting and repairing things, and it is a real issue when you take them out to train them, which is why a lot of that training is still focused on training those basic low level units, those new conscripts on kind of how to fight under our current structure and sort of how to fight in a way that is efficient, I guess, to their current situation. but yeah, I that is definitely a problem that I think we've run into. Um, it's kind of hard to take these existing personnel out of Ukraine and train them.
Yeah, definitely. And I just realized that we still didn't talk about the events, main event for this week, which is probably Nord Stream 2, which is kind of related to Ukraine
I
in
was
a
hoping we could
certain time.
avoid that. Who did it?
um,
Who knows? I mean, yeah, there are definitely, at least for Nord Stream 2, the what, four current breaches in it. Um,
yeah,
yeah, there are a lot of potential culprits, I think, right now that sort of you could point your finger generally at and say, you definitely look suspicious. Obviously, it's right outside of Kaliningrad. It's right outside of Russia's backyard, or in that area, Russia's backyard. Though it is kind of NATO's backyard at this point now that kind of that whole Sweden Finland thing has gone down. Um,
yeah,
but I the political reasons behind it, I think both sides have good reasons to want
yeah.
Nord Stream
That's
not
what I was
flowing.
going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think both sides have extremely good reason to do it actually, but yeah, I wasn't expecting such attacks on a pipeline. Uh, so yeah, I think we have talked a lot between us in the group chat and exchanged our opinions, and I think everyone have good arguments. I think honestly nobody will know in the end the end of the story because
Yeah.
this is probably classified somewhere on the earth, right? So yeah, honestly, it was. This is very important because it's going to, of course, make skyrocketing prices on the market. But outside this, it will be a very problem in terms of environment and all this stuff, which is a very problem for I think it's Denmark. It's
Wasn't it both
the
Denmark and Norwegian waters? Uh
Baltic Sea.
yeah, it might have been both of their waters that were affected by
Yeah,
this.
I think this
Yeah,
is both of the water, so this is going to be a very important problem for both countries. But yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I've seen many people talking about it on Twitter and all these medias, but nobody will know honestly. Uh, but still, it's important to, I think, at least talk about it a little bit. But that's it. I won't jump on any conclusion. I won't go to this sort of useless talks and say, yeah, this is the US or this is the Russia or. But this
I
is
think
very important anyway.
Yeah,
I
I
think
think.
the one thing
Oh no, go ahead. Sorry.
I think no worries. I think the one thing that's safe to say is Russia's going to capitalize it, no matter
Yeah,
who did it, and they're going to try to use it as a political divide within nations to try to weaken NATO. I think that's the safest thing to say right now without directly pointing fingers. I think Russia's going to utilize it to whatever capability they can.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we can agree on right now is that it's impossible to know who did it.
Yep.
There just there
yeah,
there is
definitely.
there is not enough information to say, and that's pretty
And,
rare that all of us
yeah,
can agree on that principle that we can't know.
and
It's
especially since it's in one of the most patrolled, most surveyed areas. Like the amount of there's so many questions and so little answers. And we're how many days? How many days has it been? Like 2 days?
Yeah,
yeah.
2 or 3 days, I
I
think.
mean, the other problem is it's also fairly busy waters, so it's
Yes.
pretty easy to sneak around as well. There's a reason a lot of patrols have to be kept up. It's there are a lot of essential or critical things lying on the seabed there. It's very
Yep.
busy and it's a very green water environment with that incredibly difficult environment to actually surveil. It's very easy to sneak around. Um,
And
Hmm.
I mean that brings concern to the transatlantic cable, the transatlantic cables. communication cables. Can't talk
Yeah.
today. God. Um, I, I'm hoping that there's at least increased surveillance on those after what happened with the pipeline. But I guess we'll find out.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
also a lot of people don't really. I mean, as some people may not know, um, pretty much all of our internet traffic is terrestrial. It goes through cables. It goes through cables we've laid under the
Yeah.
sea. Doesn't go through satellites. But there's a lot of redundancy to those systems where cutting those cables may only restrict some bandwidth or some speed on certain services as well. Um, it would require, and again, we don't know because no one's casually gone around yet and decided to cut those essential cables. um,
Thank God.
there there are circumstances where certain cables have experienced failures, but only to certain locations. um and that it hasn't caused major issues because they're not exactly main connections. um but yeah, I mean,
In,
we saw the cable to Svalbard. I believe it was that right before the invasion. I believe that it experienced a failure, quote unquote, um, and
yeah.
that caused some issues.
In any case, I'd say it shows that anything out. I mean, there's a war in Ukraine, right? And any target outside Ukraine can be like targeted and destroyed, which is very important to understand, I think, because let's say if anything happened in the near future with China or something, they will probably target places that we won't expect in the first place. Like, I mean, I don't think a lot of people were expecting anything on Nord Stream. I mean, unless stopping the flow. But yeah, this is very interesting to see. And I guess, as you said, I guess we can agree that nobody knows, and probably we won't know anyway.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And it
that's it.
might continue under these conditions. We might see more of this infrastructure
Yep.
attacked or compromised as long
Yeah,
as whoever is doing it, whether that be Russia or a NATO country or a Western country or who knows, is able to have that level of extreme plausible deniability. Because it's really hard for any public group to kind of point fingers, and it's hard for, the public in general to get mad at something if they don't really know who's at fault. Um,
Yep.
so that we may see that continue, and especially I think that reality has been established by this most recent attack, if it even was an attack on the Nord Stream
yeah,
pipeline.
The part I was going to say right here, by state and non-state actors. So they made sure to mention non-state actors, which I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and that's the
Um,
other thing. Russia does have a lot of like state-ish organizations that kind of serve under them.
yeah,
Cough Wagner, except Wagner is the
yep.
closest to the Russian state. There are plenty more that
Yep.
have this level of plausible deniability.
And also, I'm pretty sure that would also include hacking organizations that fall under a country, maybe not directly, but work for them. Like you look back at the Colonial Pipeline when it was attacked, or when it was never attacked, and their database was hacked and all that fun stuff. It wasn't done by Russia; it was done by a Russian criminal organization.
Yeah,
So that's
though
something interesting.
at the end of the day, though, the hacker on his computer isn't going to be placing explosive charges on the
Exactly.
seabed.
Yeah.
There's
Hey,
yeah,
you never know. He could be a very very useful person.
yeah,
yeah, very useful, definitely.
and that kind of
But
where a lot of the plausible deniability of hacking can fall apart is where direct action actually happens, and
Yes.
all of this is super black and we know nothing about it, and there's only so much we can say from our position because
yeah, definitely.
I'm sure all this information is the level of, classified of if I told you I'd have to kill you. It just,
Yeah, probably.
it isn't stuff that we could, say in any sort of definitive way.
Yep. Absolutely.
Probably, yeah. On another topic, I don't know you guys, but I'm kind of afraid of what Russia could, how Russia could act if they actually lose the war. I mean, and by losing, I mean like totally losing the war. what could be their reaction? Like we've heard a lot of nuclear threats recently, and the question is, will Russia play this game, or is it only bluff? Like often, I'd say. But yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, anytime we talk about escalation, I think there is a certain level of, I
Caution.
guess, ambiguity.
Yeah.
Mm,
Though Russian statements have certainly been unambiguous in nature. Um,
yeah,
though even when the Russians talk like that, I guess there's a certain level of, who knows what they're actually saying. No one knows for sure, to be honest. And I think that's something that we all have to take into account of how much is saber rattling for internal purposes and how much is actually, real.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many factors in play, and let's say that Putin was crazy enough to escalate in that manner. You have to consider his command structure. Is his command structure actually willing to carry out the command? Are they actually able to carry out the command? There's and not to mention the 25 decision points that would have to be reached by Putin getting to
yeah,
the actual decision to pull the trigger, not pull the trigger, or give the command to at least.
Yeah, and if people under him would even follow the instructions,
Exactly.
even
Yeah.
for something like tactical usage of a
hmm
weapon of mass destruction. Um,
Exactly.
and on top of that, of whether or not a weapon of mass destruction would even be useful in this case. I
Yeah.
mean, all these conscript units that we're talking about absolutely do not have the preparation to fight in an NBC environment. They
Well,
oh,
I don't think they really mind. Honestly, I think they really don't care about it.
well,
To be
they
honest,
still need them
so
to at least soak up bullets. If they're just,
yeah,
if they're keeling over before they even get to the front lines, there's going to be a bit of an issue. Um,
yeah. But maybe they will. I mean, let's say if with a big if they used any destruction weapon, maybe they could target any strategic infrastructure like energy places like thermal power plant, for example, like they did around Kharkiv after the counter offensive. So yeah, I don't know. Obviously, they won't send. I don't think they will send it like on cities like uh, something very close to the front line, but maybe far away behind. So at least to cause any rupture in terms of Ukrainian logistic, maybe. But I don't know.
yeah, and
If
I
they
Just
go ahead.
if they were utilized at all, there would be indications first, like he was hinting to.
yeah,
One
Hopefully,
thing we
that is
what
hopeful.
hopefully
hopefully,
there'd be indications. Hopefully we're not just killing all the Russians and saying, well, I mean, well, go ahead and kill all the Russians. You know what I mean? In theory, there would be indications that Russia was planning to utilize
hmm
we'd likely
sure,
see retrogrades. We'd likely see um, armor elements or something blocking avenues of approach, trying to buy time for a retrograde to utilize it while preserving force. And in theory, my theory at least, is that if one was utilized, it'd probably be utilized on an approach somewhere away from lots of civilians, just to try to lessen the international backlash and mitigate the chance of escalation with the U.S. Because I think Putin's still smart enough to realize what happens if he just goes off and does whatever he wants.
Yeah,
Um,
I think
there's lots of what ifs.
I still think there's the idea, at least, that Putin is a rational actor. Though the reality of that is unknown, which I think
Yep.
is the most
yeah, yeah,
terrifying part.
Yeah.
yeah. This is the most terrifying part, I think. Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly, because like you look at Putin, you look at how he was raised, you look at when he made the announcement that sorry, they were to do this quote unquote special military operation. He spent what, probably 65% of that announcement talking about the good old days with the USSR. And he has such a personal connection with the failure of the USSR that he wants to try to redeem in his mind. And because of that, that's what's scary. If he sees himself as a complete failure and is like, oh, you know what, it's never going to happen. Screw it. He's a cornered rat. What does he do? No one knows. No one knows but Putin.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
maybe we could see before all this WMD. Maybe we will see like I won't say huge protests, but maybe inside the army or the Russian common or this areas of the society. Maybe someone could try to make a coup after all, like in the end of the USSR. Uh, I don't know if it's if it's something real like realistic, but I was thinking about it. Maybe someone could just try to make any coup. I don't know. What do you think? If it's
Yeah, so
serious
the
or not?
problem is, and I've talked about this before, is that Putin's, military man, Shoigu,
Yeah.
his entire shtick has been that he's a very good political maneuvering agent.
Yes.
And he's also willing to do things that are fairly distasteful to protect the leadership.
Mm-hmm.
At least with Yeltsin before him, before Putin, he was. It appeared that Shoigu was willing to start an entire civil war, in order to sort of scare the Russian military at the time, and that was definitely concerning, and I feel like he might be willing to do that again because again this isn't like a speculative thing or as much of a speculative thing about what his personality is like. He's done this before. He was prepared to
Yeah.
give protesters in the Red Square or the in front of the presidential palace
Mm-hmm.
guns in order to start fighting. um, but I think there is that element to remember is that Putin has very carefully over the past 20 years surrounded himself with individuals that will protect him in situations exactly like this, where any other leader would be looking at serious internal turmoil. And Putin has dealt with remarkably little, at least externally appearing to deal with remarkably little.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. And he was really smart with not only who's going to protect him, but who's also not a risk to him. Um, and that's why we're kind of in the issue of how would one even be facilitated if one was to come around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the main group of people, at least he's potentially threatened by at the moment, are the ones who are extreme to the right and extreme to supporting the war effort. And those are the ones who have probably pressured him into implementing a
Yeah.
draft and taking those
Definitely.
actions.
Yep.
I
Definitely.
really
Because
oh go ahead.
yeah, go on. I was going to say because at the moment the Ukrainians were making their counter offensive. I've been reading a lot of Russian analysts, and I think we've all understood that there were two schools in Russia, and one of them was saying like we need actually to mobilize people and send them on the ground, and the other one was saying like no need for that. And it seems like the school who wanted mobilization partly won the game, I'd say, inside Russia. I mean, in terms of you know um, politics, internal politics, and I wonder how it will. What will happen if Russia actually mobilize people and they lose anyway? That's the biggest question I was asking myself honestly because you now they call for a mobilization. They can't go back. They can't stop the war or like just make their referendum in the areas occupied and say okay this is what we got and we stop here. Now they mobilize people. It means they will they will do anything to win anyway, and if they won't, honestly, I don't know how Russia can still stand up to that.
I mean, I think the one potential that there is that, let's say tomorrow Putin makes his announcement for the annexation.
Yeah,
Um, he's not going to mean it, but he could propose a, a peace with Ukraine and be like, "Hey, we're taking this, we're done," and then
yeah,
that way, it actually forced Zelensky into a position in which he has to either look like the bad guy, quote unquote, for not wanting peace, and then get to Putin gets to continue his war, or somehow miraculously Putin ends up being able to claim victory for his people. But we all know that Zelensky and Ukraine, or the rest of the world for that matter, wouldn't. No one would stand for that.
yeah,
And that's been signaled essentially daily by the U.S. and other nations.
Yeah. And again, whatever potential response there is a huge question. Um, there are ambiguities, of course, and I think they're purposely ambiguous to what any said response would look like. Um, though, of course, whatever response would happen if some weapon of mass destruction were to be used in Ukraine, it would be a fairly total response. Um, Obviously, we would be the Ukrainians. We would see them rolling around with M1s. We might potentially see direct action against Ukraine, or sorry, against Russians in Ukraine, by NATO powers. Because various countries have made it clear that if there were to be even something like a reactor explosion within Ukraine, that could trigger Article 5.
Yep.
And I don't think or I think that nuclear weapons being utilized in the country would definitely be akin to something like that.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like it's not far fetched that we'd also likely see NATO pull off some offensive cyber attacks against Russia. Cyber has the possibility to be, just as damning as a nuclear weapon, minus the kinetic action and the death. So that's always an option on the table as well.
Where are the rods from God when we need them? Yeah, though granted, there also have been the questions. There, since about 1999, there have definitely been questions of nuclear primacy between NATO and Russia about whether or not there truly is mutually assured destruction still. Um, though the questions about that have obviously raised some issues on the Russian side of increased deterrence posture when there is a crisis like this, which can raise additional risks. Delegating command or munitions release orders down to lower level units is, not exactly the most responsible thing to do, but might be necessary if the Russians believe that a first strike could potentially incapacitate, their ability to launch.
Yep.
The Russians don't have a space-based warning network. They rely on over-the-horizon, or not over-the-horizon, but early warning radar systems.
yeah,
And stuff like that means that the real Russian warning for something like a nuclear attack could be as little as 15 minutes.
Yeah, it's very short notice.
Or if nuclear-armed cruise missiles were used, the warning could be when the first, nuclear weapons detonate. No one's really sure.
And that's exactly what people always kind of forget when they think about Russia and why Russia is so bold with their stance, because their capability to respond is so much less than the U.S. and other Western nations.
Yeah. And that's definitely, again, it's something to look at. Obviously, we're entering a period. And I'll be genuine with this one. I think I've said this before, is that we've kind of entered a period with the same amount of or a quantity of nuclear tension probably not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and practical ramifications as well that I don't think have ever been seen, because at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we didn't have the same capabilities to destroy the world. Like we didn't.
yeah, definitely.
Like it was a much more difficult and drawn out process to sort of instigate nuclear war back then. There were no ICBMs, everything was bomber based. There were defenses on both ends.
Yeah, it was actually it was very fucking wild, honestly.
But
Yeah.
and I mean that's also why there was so much attention to it though, was because the indications were so large. You're able to see indications easily. We're living in an era where indications are hard to come by.
You can also turn bombers around. Can't turn
Yes.
missiles around.
Yeah,
Can't turn ICBMs around. So yeah, I
yeah,
think we are entering a fairly dangerous period where, I mean, do the Russians launch on warning? If they are to use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine first, would their nuclear arsenal go to launch on warning? Which is just such a massive threat that, like,
yeah.
And
you get a false, one unit gets a false alarm and things are going. It's done.
exactly.
Um,
Yep.
and so that is a risk that we see here, that we it might not be direct nuclear action or some sort of direct conflict that draws us down the road to nuclear war, but a mistake caused by increased tensions.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and I definitely think, again, only one side at the moment is ratcheting up the tensions. Like there is a single side that's responsible for this. This is all completely in Russia's court at the moment. They're kind of driving this entire thing, and I don't. I mean, it's their choice really to take these off ramps.
Yeah, and since we're still talking about Russia and Ukraine, I wanted to like add that I think this is kind of in terms of Osint on all sharing information on the internet. It was a revolution in terms of sharing information since the last revolution in terms of covering any war. I think was the Gulf War. It was like shared by all television and stuff, but now it's like you can literally follow anything Twitter, and I was talking with someone on the ground, and sometimes they don't they're not even aware of what's going on the ground themselves. So sometimes we even know more than them, and I think this is very important to take in account. And I feel like sometimes Russia didn't prepare themselves for all this, wasn't part of the war, I'd say, at least at the beginning. And finally, we started to see, many people's, I mean, especially Rebor, Rebor team, Russian team, started to make maps and try to use the same meters in terms of Osint after a few months. But in the end, what I wanted to say, it's crazy how in today we can like follow each step in the ground and have all the information. Like it's like a streaming basically. It's crazy.
Exactly. And I mean, I don't think Russia was prepared for the amount of eyes that would be on them all the time.
Mm.
Like think about it. Who would have thought that we would have watched a battle over a nuclear power plant live, a stream?
Yeah, I think there's
Yeah,
the other thing of the Russians also haven't been able to control the information narrative because
At all.
apparently boomers are far more susceptible to this stuff than pretty much everyone else. I
yeah,
mean, we've really seen this war governed by, or at least the information coming out of this war governed by individuals who are much more media savvy, and have a much more or a bit more of a accurate view of what's going on. Of course, there are still, and honestly, I'm extending this to the Gen X because they're also terrible on the internet.
yeah,
Sort of, there are still that element of the internet that are boomers and Gen X that fall down these rabbit holes, and honestly, the same ones are also falling down to the everything Russian is terrible, everything Iranian
Yes.
is terrible, it's all useless, it's all horrible. And I kind of see those same people falling down that rabbit hole. Honestly, there are some people who really just should not be on the internet. They're kind of just a bit
yeah,
too susceptible to like
yeah,
Yeah.
any narrative. But in general, I mean, we've seen things governed by NAFO, which, like, holy cow, Russia hasn't
yeah,
been able to
definitely.
counter that online. Like they just haven't.
Honestly, I was surprised that the NAFO movement, it's an like movement, take this importance in terms of information warfare in the end, because it was used to counter all the Russian narrative on internet, and I was honestly very surprised that Russia could do like nothing about it. They were not able to provide any, I'd say counter-offensive in terms of information warfare. And I say they were not prepared for this, and they might underestimated all this internet area. I mean, they were using different tactics, probably made in during the Cold War, but now time have changed, and this is very surprising, honestly.
Yeah,
And I
well,
think that
I think social media companies have been a bit more on top of it. I mean, ASB
Mm,
News was kicked from Twitter before the Russians reached, the outskirts of Kiev, um,
yeah,
which more, locking down on these, bodies producing disinformation, even the more official ones. I mean, RT is gone basically from the US and from the West as a whole, effectively, and
yeah.
RT was a massive disinformation operation. Um, but of course, all these smaller influencers as well are either getting every single one of their tweets with a warning, or they just aren't on aren't on any platforms anymore.
or they're
Mm,
being countered by other people that actually know the narrative, the real narrative,
Yeah.
and counter the disinformation one.
Yeah, and I think things have been much better policed in this, because again, the reality on the ground is very clear, and I think the Ukrainians understand that, and the Ukrainians have been very on top of the information sort of spectrum,
yeah,
where in the early part of the war they made it clear that if Russians were to surrender to them, that they wouldn't abuse them, and there was this establishment that they would hold prisoners of war under internationally recognized conditions, and I think those general things that those steps that the Ukrainians took sort of allowed them to kind of put together this narrative
Yeah.
that definitely helped them. Though at the same time, the Russians were doing things like rolling into Bucha and literally just shooting at everyone, like
yeah,
just
While,
just
while the
literally.
Russians while the Russians were committing a genocide, Ukrainians were having soldiers call their moms, and we saw how that played out in the digital age and throughout Twitter and other platforms, catching up on that and being like, "Hey, like lots of these people don't want to be here. It's a failing effort. Ukraine's treating prisoners of war properly, while Russia's conducting war crimes."
Yeah, and I definitely think that helped Ukraine. Um, in general, and again, it's also because there have been these more significant consequences. This isn't disinformation in an election. This is we have videos and comprehensive evidence that the Russians committed mass acts of terror and war crimes against the civilian population in Ukraine, and we have videos of it, and we have videos of them doing it, and it's kind of
And,
hard to disprove that, especially when a bunch of the videos were taken by the Russians. Like,
yes.
yeah.
like
Literally, that's the whole point. And this is very surprising because I expected them to be more, let's say, professional. Like, I don't know how to say, but it was so weird to see such mistakes. I mean, everyone have a camera and they just recorded all of their acts on the ground. So I don't know what I don't honestly I don't understand what's going on in Russia these times, and I think even Russians themselves don't really understand what's going on. And this is very surprising, but it's also interesting that to see while they were doing their war in Ukraine, they were still attacking on different subjects in terms of information warfare. And I say that because I've seen it in particular in Africa. We've seen many acts of disinformation, fake news spread on the internet, and all this stuff. I mean, they're doing it in Africa, but I feel like it just failed in Ukraine in the end.
I think part of the reason why Ukraine was able to, succeed so much with the narrative also is because it wasn't disjointed.
Yeah,
Everyone was on the same page, both on social media and also politically. I mean, when you look at how good Zelensky did with speaking to
yeah,
nations individually and also United Nations in NATO, he literally critiqued every single speech for each nation to understand how Ukraine feels. Like when he spoke with leaders from the U.S., he brought up Pearl Harbor. Like he literally, him and his writers did an amazing job transcribing the narrative to world leaders, so that way the world leaders could understand what was going on. Meanwhile, he's also making tweets. People are all on the same page all over, both on social media and politically, and that just completely over Russia's inability to maintain a single narrative.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Russia planned for more than 3 days out in this
No,
war.
no. And
Definitely
and
not.
the crazy thing about that is I don't even think they planned 3 days. Like you
No,
look at
no.
it,
I mean, if
there
you
was
look at the
there was
plan,
like
it if you look at the plan, it made a ton of sense if everything
if
went correctly.
if they
Yeah,
would have if they would have enabled the operations, but they didn't enable operations successfully.
Their
And like
assumption was
ah
that they would have
yep
taken Kiev in 3 days, and Zelensky would have either been forced from Ukraine or would have been captured or killed.
yep
None of those things happened.
nope.
And
Too
I
bad
think
they
there was,
didn't actually do some speed.
and I've said this several times, 2014 broke the Russian military complex. It broke Putin's thinking. It broke Russian thinking in general on what Ukraine was.
Yes.
There was the general idea that Ukraine wasn't well held together. The Ukrainian government was incompetent. There was massive pro-Russian sentiment in Ukraine. I mean, it's why
yeah,
there was such an aggressive push in the south was because they thought that the population there would be very friendly to them, um, and that just wasn't true. And we saw
Yeah.
people by 24 hours into the invasion. I mean, heck, 12 hours into the invasion, you know, putting up Molotov cocktails in Kiev, and we saw.
yeah. Literally, I remember seeing the mayor of Kiev. I don't know. I forget his name, but he was likely before the war. He was, I'd say, not close to Russian, but he was okay with them. And when the war started, he just joined the army and started to, um, you know, he just literally fought against the Russian. And I think it's a massive, how to say, all this war destroyed all the confidence Russia has in its in its people, in its own country. And I think we've seen it like with all these people fleeing from, like, literally leaving Russia when they started mobilization. Like, nobody wanted to go on the war, and we've seen plenty of videos of people that just wanted to, just leave this this mess. And yeah, this it was a kind of psychological trauma for Russia to not win this fast as they wanted, as they planned at least.
Yeah, I generally think that it's been difficult. Obviously,
Yeah,
it's been more difficult than they thought.
yeah, definitely.
And I mean, like you said, it all comes down to the months leading to the operations to the initial quote unquote 72 hour integration plan that they had. Faulty key assessments um, led to their ultimate demise and where we are right now, having to try to rework what they have to do. They failed to actually analyze the portions that they should have analyzed, both politically, economically, um, militarily, infrastructure, you name it. They essentially analyzed it wrong. They did not understand how the population would react. they didn't understand the amount of training the military in Ukraine had received, and they failed to comprehend how all that put together was going to lead to a hell of a fight for them.
Yeah, and I think that just that Ukrainian sort of I wouldn't call it a nationalistic sentiment, but more a sense of togetherness of
Yeah,
and yeah, there are nationalistic elements of it, but it was, in this face of an invader, basically, of
Yeah,
someone who wanted to take over their way of life and was being pretty open about it, was being pretty obvious about what they wanted to do. Russia didn't really guard themselves or hide their true intentions.
yeah, and I think it's kind of obvious. Like, let's try to be at their own place. I mean, the place of Ukraine is you. Obviously, you will fight for your country. You will fight for anything. It doesn't matter what's your political opinion. You will obviously fight for your country. You will fight for people you love. You will defend your country, basically. So yeah, that's just normal. I don't know what Russia expected, to be honest.
Yeah. And I think on that note, we'll probably wrap things up. We've been going for a bit now, but
Yeah.
thank you, both of you, for coming in and subbing.
no, absolutely. Thanks for having us.
It's been
Thank you.
extremely enjoyable to talk to all of you.
Thanks.
Absolutely, man. It was a blast to do it again.
Yep, and I'm just going to wrap that up. We will hopefully have original people back. I do hope to have both of you back on at some point. maybe 2 weeks from now. Who knows?
Yeah.
We will definitely be back at some point. And again, thank you for coming on at such short notice.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.